There is a recording. It lasts only a few minutes, just the quiet voices of two ordinary men, sitting alone in a small room inside a Mississippi sheriff's office. They don't know anyone is listening. They don't know a tape recorder has been hidden in the next room. And because they believe they are finally alone, something remarkable happens. They stop telling their story to the police and start trying to make sense of it themselves. One of them struggles to speak. The other tries to calm him down. There is no excitement in their voices, no laughter, no discussion of fooling anyone, only fear, real fear. Nearly half a century later, people still argue about what happened on the banks of the Pascagoula River that night. But before we decide what happened, we have to return to where the story began. Not inside a police station, but beside a quiet river. The Pascagoula River doesn't look mysterious. It isn't surrounded by towering cliffs or ancient ruins. It is a kind of place where the loudest sound at night is usually the splash of a fish breaking the surface. October of 1973. Life here followed a familiar rhythm. Men worked long shifts in the nearby shipyards. Families knew one another. Fishing after work wasn't unusual. It was simply a way to relax before heading home. But on Thursday, October 11th, that was exactly what two co-workers planned to do. Nothing more, nothing less. Charles Hickson was 42 years old. He had spent much of his life working with his hands. Friends described him as dependable and practical man, the kind of person who solved problems instead of creating them. His fishing partner on that evening was Calvin Parker, 18 years old, still new to the shipyard. The two men knew each other through work. After finishing their shift, they drove toward an old fishing pier near the west bank of the river, not far from Highway 90. They carried simple fishing gear, no cameras, no notebooks, no expectation that this Thursday night would become part of American folklore. The sun disappeared below the trees. Darkness settled over the river. For a while, nothing happened. The men stood quietly, waiting for a bite, listening to insects, watching ripples drift across the water. Then a sound, not loud, not sudden, a low mechanical hum. At first, Hickson thought it might be coming from one of the nearby industrial facilities. Machines operated late into the evening, but this sound was different. It wasn't steady, it seemed to move, closer. The hum grew louder, both men turned towards it. What they saw next would remain almost unchanged in every interview they gave for the rest of their lives. According to both Hickson and Parker, a glowing object appeared near the riverbank. It wasn't high in the sky, it hovered just above the ground. Hickson later described it as oval-shaped, roughly the size of a small car, with blue lights that reflected off the dark water below. There was no visible exhaust, no spinning blades, no sound of an engine. Only that strange humming vibration. The fishing rods no longer mattered. Neither man reached for them. They simply watched, trying to understand what they were looking at. Then, something moved. A section of the object appeared to open, and according to the witnesses, 3 figures emerged. What Hickson described next has become one of the most controversial parts of the entire case. He claimed he found himself inside the object, not inside a cockpit, not inside anything resembling an airplane, just an enclosed space filled with soft white light. There were no visible windows, no obvious controls, no engine, no seats. Then, he said something moved above him. He compared it to a large mechanical eye. Not an eye in the human sense, but something that seemed to observe every part of his body. He believed it examined him, slowly, methodically, without causing pain, without speaking a single word. Whether that memory reflected a real physical event or something created by extreme psychological stress remains impossible to determine. But one fact is beyond dispute. That description never significantly changed. From his earliest statements to interviews decades later, Hickson continued describing the experience in remarkably similar terms. Then, it was over. The humming stopped, the light disappeared. The river became quiet again. Hickson found himself standing, or perhaps kneeling, back on the pier. Calvin Parker lay nearby. Moments later, the younger man regained consciousness. The fishing rods were still there. The truck was still parked where they had left it. Nothing around them appeared disturbed, no scorch marks, no broken wood, no physical evidence that anything unusual had happened. Only two men, trying to understand an experience neither believed anyone would accept. For several minutes, they simply stood there, looking at each other, looking at the empty sky. Neither wanted to be the first to ask the obvious question. Did you see it too? When they finally spoke, they realized they had both witnessed something they could not explain. And now they faced another decision. Drive home and try to forget it. Or tell someone, knowing almost no one would believe them. They chose the second option. It was a decision that would change both of their lives forever. Within the next hour, Charles Hickson and Calvin Parker would walk through the doors of the Jackson County Sheriff's Office. The deputies expected two frightened fishermen. They did not expect to become custodians of one of the most debated recordings in UFO history. Because before the interviews began, someone quietly pressed record. Just after 9 o'clock that evening, Charles Hickson and Calvin Parker arrived at the Jackson County Sheriff's Office. It wasn't the first place they had considered. According to later accounts, they had first driven to the office of the Mississippi Press, hoping to tell someone what had happened. The building was closed, the lights were off. With nowhere else to go, they turned toward law enforcement. Inside the sheriff's office, deputies expected the usual calls of a Thursday night: a traffic dispute, a disturbance, perhaps someone who had been drinking. Instead, two shipyard workers walked through the door, carrying a story unlike anything the officers had ever heard. At first, the deputies were skeptical. Understandably so. Claims involving unidentified flying objects were already part of American popular culture in the early 1970s. Most officers had heard strange stories before. Very few had found them convincing, but something about these two men was different. Neither seemed excited. Neither appeared eager for attention. According to the officers present, both men looked deeply shaken. Parker barely spoke. He stared at the floor. His hands trembled. Hickson did most of the talking, but even he struggled to describe what had happened without pausing to collect himself. Whatever the truth, their fear appeared genuine. Captain Glenn Ryder had an idea. If the story was a hoax, the men would eventually let their guard down. People inventing a story together often do something without realizing it. They compare details, correct each other, ask what they should say next. So Ryder told the men to wait. He stepped into the next room, but before leaving, he quietly switched on a tape recorder. The machine remained hidden. Neither Hickson nor Parker knew it existed. The officers wanted to hear what the two men would say when they believed no one was listening. It was a simple decision, one made almost as an afterthought, yet it would become the single most important piece of evidence in the entire case. The room fell silent. For a few seconds, neither man spoke. Then Hickson broke the silence. His voice was low. uneasy. At one point, he quietly said, "God help us." There was no laughter, no celebration, no discussion of fooling the police. Instead, the recording captured two frightened people trying to understand something they believed had actually happened. Parker sounded overwhelmed. In later interviews, officers recalled that he appeared close to panic throughout the evening. On the recording, his words came slowly, fragments rather than complete thoughts. He questioned his own memory. He wondered whether he was losing his mind. Hickson didn't coach him. He didn't remind him what to say. He simply tried to reassure him. The conversation wandered naturally from one memory to another, exactly the way frightened people often speak after a traumatic event. Years later, investigators would compare that private conversation with the formal statements both men gave shortly afterward. Many of the key details were consistent, not identical word for word, but consistent enough that researchers considered the recording unusually significant. It did not prove an alien encounter, but it suggested something equally important. The two men appeared genuinely convinced that something extraordinary had happened to them. Most famous UFO cases rely almost entirely on memory. People describe extraordinary events days, months, sometimes years after they happened. Human memory is imperfect. It changes, it fills gaps, it absorbs suggestions. That's one reason eyewitness testimony is treated cautiously. The Pascagoula case is unusual because the hidden recording was made almost immediately after the event, before newspaper interviews, before television appearances, before books, before decades of retelling. It captured the witnesses at the earliest possible moment. That doesn't make every detail true, but it gives investigators something rare, a snapshot of their reactions before outside influences could shape the story. For believers, the recording represents authenticity. For skeptic, it demonstrates only that the men sincerely believed what they were describing. Oddly enough, both sides agree on one thing. The fear heard on that tape sounds real. Word traveled quickly. By the following morning, local newspapers were reporting an extraordinary claim from two Pascagoula shipyard workers. Within days, wire services carried the story across the United States. Television crews arrived, reporters surrounded the sheriff's office. Suddenly, a quiet fishing trip beside an ordinary Mississippi River had become national news. For Hickson and Parker, life changed almost overnight. Some people believed them immediately, others laughed. Many assumed the entire story would soon collapse under investigation. Instead, the investigation was only beginning. Scientists would arrive, researchers would conduct interviews, polygraph examinations would be administered, and one of the most respected civilian UFO investigators in America would take a personal interest in the case. Whether those investigations strengthened the story or exposed its weaknesses depends on who you ask. But before theories took over, before television debates, before decades of speculation, there remained one stubborn fact. A hidden tape recorder had captured two men speaking in private. And 50 years later, people are still listening to it. As the story spread across the country, so did the investigation. Reporters arrived first, then researchers. Among them was astronomer J. Allen Hynek, who interviewed the witnesses and examined the case with cautious skepticism. Charles Hickson and Calvin Parker were questioned separately. Their accounts weren't identical in every detail, but the central story never changed. Hickson later passed a polygraph examination. That doesn't prove an alien encounter happened. A polygraph measures physiological responses, not objective truth. Still, for many investigators, it became another reason the case refused to disappear. The two witnesses chose very different paths. Charles Hickson spoke publicly for the rest of his life. He never changed the story he first told inside the sheriff's office. Calvin Parker did the opposite. For decades, he rarely spoke about that night. When he finally shared his full account years later, the core of his story remained the same. Both men maintained their accounts until their deaths. Today, the old pier is gone, the witnesses are gone, but one piece of evidence remains: a hidden tape recording made before either man knew they were being recorded. It doesn't prove visitors came from another world, but it does preserve something undeniably real. Two frightened men speaking in private, trying to understand an experience they believed had changed their lives forever. Maybe it was an elaborate hoax. Maybe it was a psychological event. Or maybe something happened on the banks of the Pascagoula River that still defies explanation. We'll probably never know, but every time that tape begins to play, the mystery begins all over again.